3 months after the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, the nation of Syria is once again on the brink of a civil war. Over the last few days, battles have raged all across the northern Syrian provinces of Latakia and Tartus, with the death toll, at the time of writing, now thought to have crested above 1,000. Loyalists to the old regime and soldiers for the new are engaged in a mass act of bloodletting in the Syrian street, and according to international observers in the area, civilians aren't just caught in the crossfire, they're being hunted. It's a very tense situation on the ground, and it is the ultimate test for new Syrian leadership that's promised peace, unity, and justice in the dictator's wake. Things are moving fast, information is hazy, and the true extent of the damage isn't yet known, but it is abundantly clear that the next few days and weeks will decide the future of this fragile nation. Syria hasn't returned to civil war yet, but right now, nothing is certain, so let's get into it. So, before we begin today's episode, we've got to issue a quick caveat, as we do anytime we discuss an evolving situation here on WarFronts. The information we discuss in this episode is accurate through the very start of the day, 12:01 a.m. Monday morning local time in the city of Damascus. Anything that's happened in Syria after that time will not be covered here, although if the situation changes dramatically by the time this comes out, you can rest assured that we are probably prepping a follow-up episode to discuss those changes. With that in mind, let's begin. The current explosion of violence in northwest Syria began on Thursday, March the 6th in the small city of Jableh on the Mediterranean coast. On that day, a group of loyalist fighters supporting the recently ousted regime of Bashar al-Assad staged an ambush, reportedly killing 16 police personnel in what a security official from the region called a, quote, well-planned and premeditated attack. That same official, as quoted by DW, also said several groups of Assad militia remnants attacked our positions and checkpoints, targeting many of our patrols in the Jableh area. The quote ends. Now, those loyalist forces reportedly fired on paramedics and civilians, as well as government forces who had been attempting to detain a wanted person when they were attacked. Once the attack began, Syrian security forces responded rapidly, dispatching armed attack helicopters to strike back. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a British-based observatory that's regarded as among the best international sources on the ground in Syria, a total of 48 people were killed on Thursday, counting the dead from both sides. Now, to understand what happens in the following days, we've got to understand a little bit about where this violence took place. Estimated at a pre-war population of about 80,000 people, Jableh is part of Syria's Latakia Governorate and just north of the Tartus Governorate, two Syrian provinces where the country's minority Alawite ethno-religious group actually make up a majority of the local population. The Assad family, whose dynasty ruled Syria for over half a century until last December, are Alawites themselves, and the Assad regime spent decades fostering very close ties with the Alawite community. As a result, Latakia and Tartus, including cities like Jableh, have been perceived as strongholds for the regime or for regime support for a long time, and an outsized proportion of the sprawling Assad-era government were drawn from the Alawite community. Now that Assad has been overthrown, the situation between the Alawites and the rest of Syria, especially the Islamist leaders who've taken control in Damascus, has been very tense. And here, it's important to emphasize two things. First of all, Alawites are not and have never been uniformly loyal to Assad, but many within the minority are, and an outsized proportion of Alawites were involved with the nastiest parts of the Syrian regime. Those nastiest parts would include the so-called machinery of death that one international war crimes prosecutor estimated in December 2024 as being responsible for the torture and murder of over 100,000 people. And second, although this certainly isn't true of every Syrian, there are a fair number of people in the country who consider the Alawite minority as a whole to be synonymous with the tremendous abuses of the Assad regime. Put those two realities together, add months of rising tension and a very violent inciting incident, and we imagine that you can see what's coming next. On Friday the 7th, clashes broke out all up and down the Syrian coastal provinces as government reinforcements streamed into the area and other cells of pro-Assad loyalists seized on their moment to act in what appeared to be organized action. Curfews were put into effect in the cities of Latakia and Tartus, bearing the same name as their governorates, by the way, as well as the city of Homs. In the town of Beit Anna, locals prevented the arrest of a person wanted for trading arms, prompting clashes with local gunmen. In the district of Datur in Latakia, another ambush killed 2 state security forces, and elsewhere in the city, at least 4 civilians were killed, while in the city of Tartus, shots were fired to disperse growing protests just after curfews were declared. In Jableh and in several other towns and villages, armed gunmen loyal to the old regime were able to seize power unilaterally, and many of those areas weren't won back over the following hours of fighting. By the end of the day, on Friday, at least 99 people were counted as having been killed, bringing the total death toll to just shy of 150. At that time, Jableh had fallen entirely under the control of Assad loyalists, with several security officers held hostage. By then, reports were already starting to circulate, indicating that when Syrian government forces had taken control in some areas, they'd begun to attack civilians as well as opposition fighters. In multiple towns and villages, civilian testimony indicated that people had been beaten and had not just weapons, but money and other valuable possessions seized. Video circulated from one incident in the Alawite village of Al-Makataria, about 20 kilometers from Latakia, depicted the bodies of at least 20 people wearing civilian clothes who seemed to have been shot and killed under hazy circumstances. Later reports would suggest that as many as 40 people had been killed in the area. Other video emerged, depicting Syrian security forces executing people at point-blank range, beating their captives, and ordering captured men to bark like dogs. One man from Latakia, speaking to The Guardian, anonymously attested that at least 14 of his neighbors from a single family had been killed, including a 75-year-old man and his 3 sons, executed in front of their mother. According to one foreign source, every man that security forces found in 3 coastal villages was executed, although no women were harmed. Women and children were killed by security forces in other locations. Now, it's important to note, among gruesome stories like these, that many people who were recently aiding and abetting the Assad regime are now civilians. But it's not at all clear that it's exclusively or even partially former regime collaborators who now make up the targeted groups of civilians that have been hurt or killed. And as the weekend wore on, the numbers and reports out of northwest Syria just got worse and worse. More groups of Assad loyalists popped up, attacking asymmetrically and at times holding territory in what's looked more and more like an organized insurgency as time has gone on. Thousands of Alawites and Christians have reportedly fled their homes, with many of them fleeing to the protection of Russian forces at the nation's 2 major bases in the area. The systematic looting and burning of homes has been reported in several villages, as have continued killings of civilians, including 9 women and 4 children who were buried in a mass grave on Saturday morning. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights placed the death toll by Sunday at over 1,000, including 125 Syrian security forces, 148 Assad loyalists, and 745 civilians. Other counts of the dead are significantly higher or lower, reflecting the chaos of a situation where the truth has yet to be firmly established. According to the observatory, at least 30 individual massacres have taken place so far. So, that's the current state of affairs in northwest Syria. But why is all this happening, and who's ultimately responsible? Well, let's start with the pro-Assad loyalists, who appear to have kicked this whole thing off, because as more information starts to come out and more loyalist attacks are launched, it's become increasingly clear that this is a coordinated effort. The loyalist remnants that launched the ambushes in Latakia appear to swear their loyalty to a former general named Suhail al-Hassan, long described as Assad's favored general during the Syrian civil war and often viewed as a potential successor to the regime. Al-Hassan is in hiding, and it's not clear that he's directly involved in these attacks, but if he is, then he's a formidable enemy to be pulling the strings. He proved to be among the most effective of all of Assad's generals during the conflict, and commands firm loyalty among members of the former Tiger Forces division of special operators, for whom he was a commander. Another prominent ex-regime official, Major General Ibrahim Hawaji, was arrested in Latakia on the first day of violence, although it's not clear that any of the subsequent loyalist attacks came at his behest. The ambush and the resulting explosion of violence constitute the largest attack yet by pro-Assad forces since the regime's fall. But they're not the first, not even close. For months, Syrian authorities have been trying to root out pro-Assad loyalists who've launched asymmetric, sporadic attacks across much of the country and who've been tracked down whenever possible by Syrian security forces. According to Syrian civilians in areas where they've been active, government forces haven't always been operating above board. They've reportedly engaged in extrajudicial executions, kidnappings, and more. And in those days too, the people responsible were condemned by the government in Damascus as isolated bad actors. Government forces have faced opposition from pro-Assad loyalists well outside of Latakia and Tartus, and in fact, 15 people were killed in fighting in the south of the country on the Tuesday and Wednesday immediately before the outbreak of violence in Latakia last Thursday. Reprisal attacks have been recorded on numerous occasions against perceived or proven collaborators of the Assad regime, and Alawites in particular have been targeted by both government-associated forces and independent actors. That reality on the ground has contrasted starkly with stated policy in Damascus, where there's been a major rhetorical push against acts of retributive violence. The national government has made it a top priority, at least at its highest levels, to emphasize the need for unity and peaceful coexistence between all Syrians, underscored by the need to bring justice to the people who enabled and enacted the Assad regime's worst abuses. The new government has explicitly promised that Alawites under their rule would be safe, revenge killings would not take place, and Alawites would have just as much a place in Syria's future as anybody else. Then again, the nation's leaders have yet to hold meetings with senior Alawite figures at a time when they've already had those meetings with prominent Christians, Druze, Kurds, and others. The Alawite community is reportedly split in its stance toward the new leadership in Damascus, with many advocating for peaceful and active reconciliation, but others preparing to take up arms and warning that they're becoming Syria's new target. As for the reported deaths of several hundred civilians in the current crisis, Syria's transitional government has blamed these killings on, quote, individual actions, meaning basically Syrian security forces who acted outside of their mandate. They've also implicated unorganized groups of civilians and militia groups who sought to support security forces but acted egregiously, committed acts of violence against civilians, or took advantage of the chaos to loot and steal. One unnamed state security official, speaking to Syrian state news, suggested that many people had gone to the coastal regions on their own once violence broke out to get revenge for recent attacks elsewhere. The nation's interim leader, Ahmad al-Sharaa, vowed in a Friday speech that, quote, anyone who harms civilians will face severe punishment. And he described the flare in violence as being, quote, within the expected challenges during a Sunday address. Now, to be clear, that statement was made before it became clear internationally just how widespread violence against civilians had been, although it's not clear what al-Sharaa himself knew and when. Whatever the case may be, his public statements have been focused on stopping any atrocities or violence against civilians. Said al-Sharaa, urging Syrian forces to treat civilians and captives fairly, quote, when we give up on our morals, us and our enemy end up on the same side. Now, on the one hand, the idea that security forces or nearby civilians would operate in a way contrary to the Syrian government's mandates is, well, not really an unbelievable accusation. Syria's new security forces are a haphazard mix of former rebels from various ethnic, religious, and ideological backgrounds working together with ex-regime defectors in a shaky coalition where command structures are new and untested, and where, in a practical sense, security forces can act on their own if they choose to. The same is true for militia forces, who haven't yet given up their weapons, and for civilian mobs who might be even less willing to listen to the new government. Even members of al-Sharaa's own pre-takeover rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, have disagreed sharply with the inclusive, equality-orientated frame that al-Sharaa has approached peace and reconciliation with, and it's not necessarily a surprise that hardliners would have chosen to respond their way to the Alawite communities in front of them, rather than following the guidance of Damascus. On the other hand, even if Damascus isn't ordering these executions, which to be clear is not guaranteed either, the fact that hundreds of such executions can take place unchecked speaks to very weak central authority and the presence of large and very dangerous elements within the Syrian security forces. One leading voice among the Alawite community, the Alawite Islamic Council, blamed the Syrian government directly for the violence, saying that fighters had been sent to Latakia and Tartus, quote, with the pretext of fighting regime remnants to terrorize and kill civilians. So, as we turn our attention to the question of what comes next, it's important to emphasize that as shocking as this past week in Syria has been, it's not necessarily a surprise. We've said it many times on this channel, and most experts on the conflict have expressed similarly that this is a very fragile moment for Syria, where the looming threat of large-scale violence has been impossible to ignore. There are an incredible number of grudges and old wounds in Syria right now, stemming from almost a decade and a half of civil war, and for remaining pro-Assad factions to make a play for power was certainly not unthinkable. Nor was the idea that members of Syria's security forces might be looking to settle scores or exact broad violence against people they see as responsible for Syria's suffering. The question has never been, whether this period in Syrian history would be violent. That much was all but assured. The important questions are, how widespread will the violence become, and can it be contained? Now, the first question, the violence does appear as if it's continued to spread, at least at the time of writing. New battles are breaking out in new locations, including a potentially devastating firefight that began on Sunday at a gas power plant in the city of Banias in Tartus. There, in Banias, large massacres have reportedly taken place. Because of the chaos on the ground, it's not currently clear just how much of the violence is a direct result of ambushes or attacks by Assad loyalists versus what's coming from pro-government forces carrying out atrocities versus what's coming from third-party militias or even civilians taking advantage of the violence. But although government forces have made progress in taking back some areas, new hotspots are continuing to flare. The city of Jableh, where the violence first broke out, has now reportedly been taken over by armed groups, with electricity and water taken out several days ago. There, residents report hiding in their homes for their own safety, while armed groups outside use bulldozers to dig mass graves for at least 50 dead, and probably more. And then there's the question of whether this flare-up can be contained. According to some Syria experts, the fighting we're witnessing now isn't likely to sustain for long. Gregory Waters, expert specifically on coastal Syria, suggested to the Associated Press that sustained fighting is unlikely, although a long-term cycle of local violence and an effort to take up arms within the Alawite community may come next. Other assumptions are a good deal more pessimistic, with anonymous Syrian security forces suggesting to foreign press that as many as 5,000 pro-Assad loyalists may be hiding out in the northern mountains. Government helicopters have dropped anti-submarine depth charges as a form of bombing in order to root some of them out, but it's not likely that those tactics will be effective at scale. If indeed multiple thousands of pro-Assad fighters are out there in northern Syria, then they could keep up an asymmetric insurgency for months or even years, especially by seizing on support from an Alawite community that's now experienced dozens of massacres at the hands of the same people these loyalists are trying to fight. So, as for what happens next, the evolving situation in northern Syria seems to suggest that this crisis will be neither brief nor easy to end. Internationally, Arab world powers from Turkey to Saudi Arabia appear to be giving the Syrian government the benefit of the doubt, indicating that Islamist factions outside the government's control are ultimately responsible for the worst of the violence. That's a sentiment echoed across much of Syrian society, at least for the time being, including in some areas where the violence is ongoing. But underlying that nuance is a difficult reality, that the Syrian government must establish control over these factions if the violence is to conclude. That's absolutely imperative for Damascus, because the question that nobody wants to be asking about Syria is the question of what will happen if the current leadership is proven to be too weak to keep control over its own security forces. According to well-connected foreign experts who visited Syria since the overthrow of Assad, it is a common sentiment inside Syria that the global press has made too much of the country's sectarian divides, Sunni or Shia, Alawite or Druze, those sorts of community groupings. Syria has always been a diverse place, and much of the Syrian public seems to support an approach to peace and reconstruction where that diversity is simply a non-issue. But that approach is nearly impossible to implement in a world where state security forces will engage in the mass execution of Alawites who appear to have been civilians, regardless of the instruction those security forces get from Damascus. Not only do these attacks give Alawites a very legitimate set of reasons to fear for their lives, but they create a situation where pro-Assad loyalists can credibly position themselves as protectors of the Alawite community, thus setting up even larger and more devastating flare-ups later. Not only that, but weak government authority creates permissive environments for other armed groups to take unilateral action, from local militias who want control of their communities to former rebel factions at cross purposes with the government to even the Islamic State in the Syrian heartland. Look, we've said it here on WarFronts since the days after Assad fell. It is good to be optimistic. It is good to recognize apparent positive signs from the new Syrian government. But it is beyond premature to assume that the Syrian civil war has ended. Then and now, it is imperative for the Syrian transitional government to assert and keep control, respond to challenges like these, and ensure the safety and security of all Syrians if the war is to really conclude. And to be clear, this current crisis does not mean that an end to the war is impossible. What the current crisis does indicate is that Syria is at a moment of truth right now, with no way out of this catastrophe but through it. Perhaps this ends with Damascus proving it can establish control, restore order, and defeat the pro-Assad forces that remain. Perhaps it ends with Syria's Mediterranean provinces under the control of Assad loyalists. Perhaps it ends in justice for those civilians that have just been massacred, or perhaps it doesn't end until there have been many more massacres than the ones we've seen. Whatever happens now will decide Syria's future. So let's hope that Syria can somehow find its way to peace. Thank you for watching.